It's a great pleasure to be here and to again have a chance to talk about my work. And I should say that this is completely different to what I talked about previously, because I have, in a way, two lines of work. One is on morality and various bodily influences, emotional influences on moral judgments. And the other line of work is on how people make perceptual judgments and how those are also influenced by various embodied factors. And that's what I'll be talking about today. And I should say I'll be in town for another month or so. So I'd love to talk to people and find out what you guys have been up to. Right, now, first question. What do you think about a slice of pizza right now? Well, chances are that the answer to that question depends on whether you have a plate full of food in front of you already or not, right? So if you're feeling pretty hungry right now, that slice of pizza will look really appealing. If you just ate, it won't really do much for you, right? So it's in a way obvious that the way we look at certain objects depends on what they mean to us in that given moment, whether I'm hungry or not, whether I like pizza or not, and so on. And I will argue that when it comes to people's perception of the physical environment, it's actually very similar, that how we look at the world depends on our current state. So this may seem a bit surprising because, of course, if we think of, standing in front of a steep hill, that hill has a very objective incline. I mean, there's nothing subjective about it. But I will argue that, well, just like, when we look at other things around us, we take into account how we feel at a given moment, what physical resources we have available, whether we're full of energy, for example, or not, and so on. And this idea is based on what's been called the economy of action approach, proposed by Denny Profit. And in some of his earliest work, he showed that when people stand in front of a steep hill, how they see that hill depends on how able they are to get up that hill in that given moment. So for example, somebody who is burdened with a heavy backpack will find the hill to be much steeper than somebody who's not, right? Or an elderly person will find the hill to be steeper than a young person. Or somebody who just went for an exhausting run will find it more steep than somebody who did not, and so on. So it's all about this idea that however you're feeling in a given moment shapes how the physical environment looks to you. And this is something I've investigated in various contexts. So for example, we looked at people's level of physiological resources and to what extent somebody's full of energy or exhausted and depleted, and how that shapes their perception. So for example, we had people stand in front of a steep hill, and we gave them a drink full of sugar, or a drink that tastes just the same, but is just full of artificial sweetener rather than sugar. So people would be getting that drink, and under the cover story that it's a consumer taste test, so they don't really, we don't want them to make the link between the slant perception of the hill and the drink. So we give that to them, and we find that people who had the sugary drink find the hill to be less steep than those who had the drink with a sweetener. So to us, that indicates that when one is literally physically full of energy, the world looks like a less challenging place. A steep hill looks less steep than it otherwise would. So people draw upon physiological resources on a very basic bodily level. I mean, it would be easier to walk up a hill if I'm full of energy, literally, as opposed to when I'm not. But they also draw upon more, in a way, psychological resources. So not just the physiology of the body that gets them ready to act, but there's various factors that we've looked at that shape how people see the world because they relate to the resources that one has available. So in some other work, we looked specifically at a well-known resource, which is social support. having people around you who, who are there for you, who are supportive and who you can count on. So, for example, in some work we had people, again, this is our standard paradigm. People stand in front of a steep hill. Sometimes we also, give them a heavy backpack to really make the situation challenging. Usually it's a steep hill rather than a flat hill, and I think that's quite important so that it's really an action that would be difficult to accomplish. Again, in combination with the backpack especially. So we, for example, have participants who stand at the hill by themselves, they're alone, or they stand there in the presence of a friend, right? And then we find that when people have a friend by their side, they find the hill to be less steep than when they're alone. Now, in some follow-up work, we find that it's not just having literally somebody by your side, but just that psychological sense of social support, just the notion that there is somebody there for you. So for example, by having participants go through an imagery task where they think of somebody, think of a significant other who's always supportive, who they can count on at any point, versus a person who they used to feel close to and they no longer do because that person betrayed their confidence, relative to a neutral person, for example. And again, we find that just kind of eliciting that sense of social support has an impact on how people see the world around themselves. So this was some early work. I don't want to get in too much detail, and I want to really focus on some of the more recent studies we've done that all build on this idea that when people look at the physical environment, they take into account the resources they have. So that could be on a physiological level, the kind of energy they have available. That could be on a more social or psychological level, the kind of, whatever they perceive to be a resource that is, providing support in some sense. And so some of the most recent work I've done with my PhD student, Eun-hee Lee, we looked at the notion of social power. So power is, of course, all about resources, right? It's defined as having access to resources and having control over your own resources and also other people's resources. So it's all about, having something or not, or somebody else has that control over you. And we looked at the extent, again, to which that shapes how people perceive objects, or the physical environment, I should say. And in this context, we actually, rather than looking at hillsland perception, which is a domain that has been investigated in quite some detail, we explored a new context, namely weight perception. So literally, lifting up a heavy box and estimating how heavy that box is. So again, power is all about the notion that one has resources available and control over one's resources, so that powerful people have access to resources not only for themselves but also for other people. And powerless people, on the other hand, they have to unfortunately depend on the powerful in order to gain resources. So it's been shown previously that having power or not has various cognitive consequences. So for example, Anna Guinot has shown that when somebody feels powerful, they are more cognitively flexible. So they can choose what strategy they use. They don't have to necessarily try to focus on everything that's available. Whereas what happens with powerless people, they tend to be more vigilant. They tend to be trying to pay attention to everything around them because it's so important to them to kind of, in a way, figure out what's going on and make sure that that they're paying attention and they're alert. So it leads to a certain type of vigilance. And so this is just in terms of thought processes in general, but we were primarily interested in, again, the perception of physical attributes. So it's building on the notion of the economy of action, And in a first study, we simply looked at individual differences in the extent to which people feel powerful, to the extent they have resources. So there's a personality scale called the Personal Sense of Power Scale, developed by Anderson and colleagues, and it has various items such as, in my relationship with others, I can get people to listen to what I say, and related items. So it's all about simply people's subjective feeling of power, not necessarily whether they do have control over other people or their resources, but subjectively that sense of being powerful. And we had participants fill out that scale and also had them give us weight estimates of 2 heavy boxes. One at least was pretty heavy, 8.2 pounds. The other one was 2 pounds. So they gave weight estimates simply on, how heavy is it on a scale, how many pounds, how heavy does it feel to you, under the cover story that we're looking at the ergonomics of working environments. And then we correlated participants' sense of power, the personal sense of power, with their weight estimates. And if we find a negative correlation. So the more subjectively powerful participants felt, the less heavy they estimated the box to be. Now, of course, this was just correlational evidence, and we then also experimentally tested the idea that social power and perception may be related. So we had a power manipulation and that we administered, and participants had a before and after block of weight estimates where they had a number of boxes. They had 5 boxes with the identical weight each time, before the manipulation and afterwards. And again, it was the same paradigm. They were holding out their arms. We put a box on it. Usually they were asked to close their eyes and simply tell us, roughly how much does that box weigh. Now, to manipulate power, we used a procedure that's been used by Carney, Cuddy, and Yap, where they found that when people take on certain bodily postures, that can coincide with a sense of feeling powerful. So in our particular example, we had, these were the photos from their paper, and it looked a bit different in our work because we used a cover story where we told participants that we're looking at ergonomic office chairs. So it was a chair where one could either lean back and sit in a very expansive posture or, sit in a more constricted posture, and that was the high versus the low powerful conditions. And what we find then, so when it comes to the weight estimates, so what's plotted here is accuracy of the weight estimates. And we compare the before and after. So we find that the high power condition finds the weight to be less heavy after they've gone that manipulation, whereas that's not the case for the low power condition. So it seems like the high power participants habituate to the heaviness of the boxes, whereas the low power people do not.
I'm sorry, the manipulation is in between the estimates?
Sorry, it was a within subjects design. So they had the boxes before the power posture and then again after the posture. That's right. So that was one study, and we also were curious whether having power or lacking power had an effect. So we had another study where we also included a neutral control condition. And in this case, we used a different power manipulation, again having a within subjects design where a bunch of boxes before the manipulation and then again after the manipulation to have a comparison. But this time we asked participants to write about a time when they felt either powerful or powerless. So in this case, it was not this kind of bodily manipulation, but a more cognitive manipulation. And we get a very similar finding where when it comes to the high power condition, after having gone through that manipulation, after having reminded themselves of a time where they felt powerful, participants found those boxes to be less heavy than on the baseline. And it seems like, I should say that the high power condition and the control condition look very similar. So the effect really seems to be about the lack of power. Not being able to, controlling resources and so on makes a burden literally feel heavier. So this is about, looking again at this notion of having social resources, not necessarily physiological resources, but having something, some kind of mental or cognitive sense of, being in charge, having access to things that are important. And the question then is, okay, why should that influence something physical in a way? And one possibility is that if one invokes Blaskovich's model of threat versus challenge, is that related to that is an earlier finding that has shown that when people are confronted with either a threat versus or rather with a difficult situation, when one has power, people are more likely to see it as a challenge as opposed to a threat. And there's a certain cardiovascular response that's associated with, having, in a way, feeling that one has the necessary resources to deal with a certain difficult situation, such that it's perceived as just a challenge rather than something that's unsurmountable and that's a threat. So it seems like, or it's possible, this is a speculation of course, that on some level when people just psychologically think of the kind of resource or the kind of control of resources they've had in the past, or they physically embody a sense of power, then these notions are brought up as well. So there is quite a bit of evidence then that supports this notion of this economy of action, that people, when they look at the physical environment, they take into account how easy or difficult it is to engage with certain properties. So for example, the slant of a hill is about how easy or difficult it would be to get up that hill versus, there's been research on distance estimates as well. Now we've looked at weight estimates in addition. And something that we've recently started looking at is not so much just the availability of resources, whether on a physiological level or on a more psychological level, but also motivational considerations. So the extent to which when I'm, motivated to engage in an action, or when there's certain features of the environment that are either appealing or not so much, whether that also changes how those things look to me. So with Dario Krapan, we've most recently looked at whether when an action is impending and about to happen, whether on some level this anticipation of, especially a costly action, something that requires a lot of energy, whether that in a way also feeds back into perception such that our perceptual estimates in a way tell us that, wait a minute, this is going to be really difficult, and it's better to put on the brakes and reconsider whether it's really a good idea, for example, to walk up that hill. And again, the idea is that perhaps on some level our perception tells us how easy it would be for us to act in the environment. So what we've been looking at is a very basic motivational tendency of approach versus avoidance. So there's been quite a lot of work in social psychology that has shown that, well, first of all, these are some very basic motivational tendencies, but they also are related to physical action. So it's been shown that when people are engaging in a pulling behavior, that has various consequences that relate to approach, versus if they're pushing, in a way, that's about avoidance. And that simple movement can be activated, or can be that notion of the motivational state can be brought up by simply having people press against a table one way, in one of two ways. So if one presses from the top, that's like pushing, as opposed to if I were to press here from the bottom, that's pulling. And it's quite remarkable how powerful just that simple manipulation is of having people engage in this flexion or extension of the muscles involved in approach and avoidance. So we looked at the extent to which this notion of approach or avoidance relates to people's slant estimates, hill slant estimates. So we predicted that when somebody is considering getting up a steep hill and they're engaged, or rather, I should say, when they're standing in front of a steep hill and having the sense of approach activated, that indicates to them that, well, I'm about to go up that hill, I'm approaching that hill. And when that happens, perception should tell you, I mean, if it's a very steep and challenging hill, perception should tell you that, wait a minute, are you sure you really want to do this? This is, perhaps not a good idea. Let's consider whether you have the resources. Let's consider whether this is something you can do. For approach cues compared to avoidance cues. Now, the whole logic that I've been describing is that the perception tells you something about the actions that are useful to engage in or that easy enough to engage in. But if that's true, it should also be the case that, that works for some people, for whom the action really is a possibility and feasible, as opposed to people for whom, it's unlikely to happen. And for that reason, we looked at participants' physical ability. So in what shape they are, whether they're in good shape or not so much in terms of fitness. So we had simply participants stand at the base of a steep hill, and this, as you can see, it is, it would be a challenging hill to get up. And it was, I will admit, a bit of an awkward setup because we had a step ladder next to them where they were, either engaging in pulling behavior by, this kind of motion or pushing behavior, simply by putting their hand next to the step ladder and pressing in one of two ways. So this was to activate approach versus avoidance cues. And then they gave us various slant estimates. And I should now perhaps back up a little to explain how we usually do this. So we usually have a verbal estimate where we simply ask participants, how steep is that hill? If this 0 is completely flat versus 90 degrees is like a wall. Tell us how steep the hill is. That's a verbal estimate. Then we also usually get a visual estimate. This is a nonverbal indicator where the task is for participants to adjust that pie-shaped piece to reflect the incline of the hill. And then we have a third measure, which we call a haptic measure, which is to put their hand on this palm board and make it parallel to the hill. So it's actually important to keep in mind how people usually respond on those measures. So the verbal, and what's not plotted here is the visual measure, but that looks very similar as the verbal. The verbal and visual measure usually indicate, sorry, I just lost my slide. Pressed the wrong button here. Sorry about that. Here we are. Right. So the verbal and visual estimates, participants usually vastly overestimate. So a 5-degree hill, they will say it's 20 degrees. A 10-degree hill, they will say it's 30 degrees. So they're really, it's basically hills look much, much steeper to people than they really are when they're on some level explicitly saying that, okay, this is the kind of number or the kind of estimate I put on the hill. As opposed to when they use this haptic measure, the palm board, they're actually surprisingly accurate. And the way this has been explained is that these measures, the verbal versus visual on one hand, but the haptic on the other hand, that they relate to different types of different aspects of the visual system, where one, the verbal and visual measures capture, or that they relate to the ventral stream, which is about planning an action, and therefore it's important to take into account resources and anticipate how easy or difficult it would be to engage in that action, as opposed to the haptic measure, which relates to the dorsal stream, which is about how one executes an action. So how I would adjust my foot and how I would put it on that hill in order to walk up that hill. And if you think about it, carrying out the action always has to be done in the same way, right? I mean, whether I'm, for example, full of energy or not is not going to change how I need to lift up my foot. But when I try to anticipate whether it's a good idea in the first place to get up that hill, it's better for me to be on the safe side and say that actually, you know what, that's an awfully steep hill. So people overestimate when it comes to this kind of notion of trying to anticipate how easy or difficult something is, as opposed to they're reasonably accurate when it's about how one carries out the action. So that also means that when it comes to various manipulations of resources, in pretty much all the findings I described so far, one usually gets an effect only for the verbal and visual measures. So whether somebody's wearing a backpack, whether somebody's elderly or young, whether somebody's exhausted, whether there's social support, and so on. All these manipulations only have an effect on the verbal and the visual estimates because they're about taking into account resources and planning ahead, as opposed to for the haptic estimate, there's usually nothing there. And that's predicted because, again, one needs to carry out the action in the right way, regardless of the resources that one has available. So back to our study where we had people engage in this pushing or pulling behavior. So we also had a moderator of physical fitness where we simply asked participants, how are you feeling today and what shape are you today? Very unwell to excellent. And we took that into account in additional analysis where we looked at, this sense that, would somebody be able to easily get up the hill or not? So what's plotted here is perhaps we first look at the people who are in relatively poor physical condition. For them, there's really not all that much going on when it comes to the different estimates. So what's shown here is, first of all, the verbal and the visual measures, and then the haptic measure. Now, when we look at people who are in relatively good physical shape, they say that, we find that under approach, so when they're, pulling, they say the hill is steeper for the verbal and the visual measures compared to when they're engaging in avoidance. So it's as if this notion that, I'm about to go up that hill tells me that, wait a minute, you know what, that's an awfully steep hill. So you may want to reconsider, or you may want to take into account whether you're really ready to do that. But only for people for whom getting up that hill or trying to walk up there is a reasonable possibility in the first place because they're in relatively good shape. I should say, so this is the moderation that takes into account the physical fitness, but there's also a main effect without that. So in general, approach leads to higher estimates than avoidance on the verbal and the visual measure, whereas there's as we would predict, there is no effect for the haptic measure. So this is some first evidence that this notion that action is impending because I'm approaching changes how steep a given hill looks at that moment. Now, I should say we also looked at whether mood is something that plays a role here. It doesn't seem to. But then, of course, this somewhat awkward contraption of having the step ladder next to participants, it is a bit of an unusual testing situation. So there may be effects of the difficulty of pressing against the ladder in different ways and so on. And also, the idea of approach and avoidance really is not just about, physical approach or avoidance, but also it has been shown on a more cognitive level as well. So Friedman and Förster, they developed a maze task where the participants need to help the mouse either get to the cheese, so basically, start in the middle and move outwards, or help the mouse run away from the owl. Now, this has been shown to also activate the notions of approach versus avoidance, but doing so very differently than this kind of push-pull movement that I mentioned previously. So So we had another study where we simply had that manipulation, one of those two mazes, or a control condition. And again, this was done at the hill. Participants told us how steep the hill is along those various measures. And we get a very similar picture. If anything, the effects are actually stronger, where again, so even though there's a main effect in general, such that participants under approach find the hill to be more steep than those under avoidance, it's especially pronounced for people who are in good physical condition. So people who are, for whom it's feasible to get up that hill, for them, when they're anticipating that they're about to go up, then perception tells them that, well, this is actually a really steep hill. So, and in this case, we also had a control condition which fell somewhere in between, but the real effect is about the approach condition. Now, the whole argument here is that this notion of approach or avoidance tells you something about, about impending action, right? That how your ability to engage with the environment relates to how it looks to you. So we reasoned that this approach or avoidance should only be relevant as long as it's actually meaningful in that context, right? So pushing, or rather pulling, I should say, pulling or solving the maze in a way that is about approach should only be meaningful as long as it is about, this action is impending, but not when it's explicitly ruled out that, for example, one has to walk up the hill. So we ran another study where we had all approach conditions, that same maze task that I showed you earlier, but we had three different versions of it. So in particular, in the approach and climb condition, we told participants that, well, first we'll do these slant estimates, and then, at the end of the study, you'll actually have to walk up that hill, depending on, it's up to you how much you want to walk, but it's about actually engaging with that hill, as opposed to the approach and the no climb condition where that is explicitly ruled out. That, well, we'll be doing these slant estimates, but you know what, don't worry about it, you don't have to actually walk up that hill. As opposed to just the same approach instructions, just that same maze without any additional details. So what we find, and again, we're primarily interested in people who are in good physical condition, we find that when there is an approach cue, but it's explicitly ruled out that one actually has to engage in approach and walk up the hill, then we don't find this effect. Then basically there is no indication that approach makes the hill look more steep. Compared to when approach is combined with explicit instruction of, you're going to have to climb up the hill, or without those instructions. So having instructions added to the approach cue doesn't really change things. So approach on its own already indicates in a way that, well, it means that you're about to get up that hill. So that means that, when we think about these psychological cues to do with motivation, it's not just, a very direct effect, but it's about how meaningful that cue is in that situation. And when it's clear that it has no relevance, then it's not taken into account. So this was, looking at these motivational tendencies in the context of slant perception, I should say here. Now, just to sum up that when it comes to these, especially for people for whom action is feasible, when it comes to approach cues, in a way, perception tells us that, well, you may want to be careful because this environment that you're engaging with is really challenging, and it's perhaps not a good idea to use up your resources in this way, or perhaps you don't even have the resources, so be careful. Now, we've also recently looked at different contexts of these motivational influences where it's not just about hill slant perception, but about perception of distances to objects that are either positive or negative. And as in a way is obvious, this whole idea of approach and avoidance is about, you want to approach good things, but you also want to avoid bad things. This is the compatibility of the kind of behavior one engages in and the object that one considers while engaging in that behavior. So when it comes to the combination of this approach versus avoidance tendencies and the objects towards which one engages at that moment, we've previously shown that when there's a mismatch, an incompatibility between the two, then that seems to have some sort of cognitive costs, or that in a way leads to some conflict that people are trying to resolve. So we found that when people were engaging in avoidance, approach and pulling in response to negative stimuli, or when they were engaging in avoidance in response to positive stimuli, that led to deteriorated memory performance. And there were various indicators that it seems like people were trying to resolve in a way they were too busy trying to resolve the conflict or this incompatibility that they didn't have as many resources available as other participants to devote to the memory task. So there seems to be some indication that when things don't match up, people or the cognitive system in a way tries to resolve things in order to make sense of that inconsistency. And there's also related work by Emily Balchetis and colleagues. They've looked at motivation in the context of various perceptual estimates, and that they find that when participants experience cognitive dissonance because they agreed to walk in an embarrassing costume around campus, and they have to estimate how long the distances are that they're covering, when they're in a state of in this state of cognitive dissonance and therefore conflict, they say, oh, actually, you know what, that distance wasn't so long. It wasn't a big deal in a way, right? That, well, I got, so in an attempt to resolve cognitive dissonance by saying that, well, I agreed to do this, I got myself into it, therefore it wasn't all that bad and the distance wasn't all that long anyway. So there's some indicator that people have some tendency to try to resolve conflict by bringing things closer. Now, what we predicted for our context was to look at the combination between approach and avoidance cues and certain valence stimuli that were either positive or negative, to then see to what extent that changes how far those valenced stimuli look. And based on this earlier work on people's tendency to try to resolve conflict whenever cues are inconsistent, we predicted then when there's an incompatibility between the motivational tendency and the stimulus to which it's experienced, the distance should be perceived as closer. Because when something is right in front of you, when it's close to you, it motivates you to resolve the inconsistency, to basically deal with conflict. So it's a conflict. If there's a conflict, it's good if that conflict is right in front of you, and you have it's right there in order to resolve the problem. So we had a series of studies where the paradigm was always pretty similar. We had participants sit here and at the edge of the table, and we always placed a card on the table with their name written on it so that it was clear that they were meant to estimate the distance from that little black line that was drawn on the card to the object. So we asked them to estimate how far away is this particular word. The way we did it was to, at the same time, have participants engage in approach or avoidance behavior in the same way as I described before, with pushing versus pulling movements. And they looked at a number of these words. And then we had an experimenter who was standing behind the table and who was holding up a tape measure. and was showing participants the tape measure in a way that the numbers were facing away from the participant, and simply pulling out the tape to say, okay, tell me when the length of the tape reflects the distance between you and that word. So this was how participants made the distance estimates. And what we then looked at was this combination of, approach versus avoidance and positive versus negative stimuli. And we find a quite strong effect. What's plotted here is the distance, such that when basically pulling is paired with negative stimuli, or when pushing is paired with positive stimuli, those stimuli are perceived to be closer than when they're in the matched condition. So on some level, these objects seem much closer than they are. Now, so this was the combination of these motor behaviors and positive and negative words. We then again used the same logic with, rather than actual physical movements, looking at the more cognitive activation of approach and avoidance, and again using that maze task and combining that with photos that were presented in front of participants. So at a certain distance, the photo was shown, and participants again using that tape measure that the experimenter was holding out, estimating the distance to those photos that were either negative or positive, taken from some standardized sets. And here we also had a control condition where there wasn't all that much interesting happening. But as before, we find that when there's a combination of approach behavior and negative cues, or avoidance behavior and positive cues, the distances are much shorter than when the behavior and the valence are matched. And again, it's a pretty substantial effect, actually. So it seems that there is some notion that when things don't match, they seem much closer than they are. So perhaps in an attempt to bring a problem close and say that, well, do something about this. Something is wrong here. Try to figure out what's going on, as opposed to when things the way they're supposed to be, where we approach good things and avoid bad things. So if that is true, if there really is this notion that when things don't match, people, perception tells you that you need to do something about it and solve a problem, basically, then we should be able to capture that somehow. So in another study, we had an additional part of the experiment where we actually included that whole sense of trying to capture whether people are in some sort of activation or some sort of have this notion that they need to solve a problem or basically do something about a conflict. So we drew upon a task used by Albarracin and colleagues that was simply, a list of reasonably simple anagrams, and participants can decide for themselves how many of those they wanna solve. So we had, just as in the earlier study, approach versus avoidance with this cognitive activation, and then I should say also, well, wait a minute. In this case, it was words. So we had various experiments actually where we combined the physical approach versus avoidance versus the cognitive activation with either photos or words. In this case, it was the combination with words. And then at the end of the study, participants were told that, well, here is a list of anagrams, just solve as many as you like and you can stop at any point. Now, what we found for the distance estimates was exactly what we had seen now several times before, that again, when there is the mismatch, approach and negative items and avoidance and positive items, these words seem closer than when there is a match. But then importantly, when it comes to this notion of trying to capture participants' sense of, well, in a way trying to resolve inconsistency or conflict, we find that in these mismatched conditions, approach and negative or avoidance and positive, participants solved more of the anagrams, or attempted to solve more, I should say. So it's as if there's some notion that, you know, it increases behavioral activation. We also had an indicator of behavioral activation, and there was a negative correlation between that and people's distance estimate. So the more activated and, in a way, alert people felt, the shorter were the distance estimates. So it suggests that there is some notion that when there's a conflict, perception brings things closer to you, because then once things are immediate, you can try to do something about a conflict, or you try to engage with it more readily, even if, as in this case, the kind of action you're engaging in has actually no relevance or no practical use for that particular issue. So to just summarize, we find that when we have approach and positive things, these items look further away than we have approach in response to negative items, whether they're photos or pictures. And by the same token, when we have avoidance and positive things, they seem closer than when we have avoidance and negative things. So again, our interpretation is that it's about that perception is helpful in terms of trying to, in a way, solve problems or guiding future action. And I think it's important to keep in mind that when something seems close, that can mean many things. I mean, for example, in this case, we think it's about resolving a conflict. In other contexts, for example, in Emily Balchettis' work, she's found that when people look at a desirable object and they're in a state in which that object is very meaningful, so people who are thirsty and they're looking at a bottle of water, it looks closer. So it's about so this notion that, you know, whether something looks close or far is probably relatively complicated in terms of what it means in that particular context, how it's adaptive, how it's useful, whether it's about trying to get that object, as opposed to in our context, it's about trying to resolve that inconsistency where something feels off. So I think it's important to keep in mind that whether something is close versus far is not always all that straightforward. So, but overall, I mean, there's now quite a bit of evidence that suggests that when people perceive various objects in the world, they take into account, for one thing, various resources, so physiological resources to do with literally having energy, or, you know, being burdened in some way, or more, in a way, psychological resources to do with social power, for example, or with social resources. And we're now starting to look at these more motivational considerations as well, where it's about, you know, actions to do in response to a certain stimulus that can either be positive or negative, that can be challenging, for example, like a steep hill, and in which context it's adaptive for our perception to give us some indicator of whether it's a good idea to engage in that context or not. So back to that slice of pizza. Again, I would argue that when we look at the physical environment, what we see is very much a reflection of our internal state. Thank you. Yes?
Let me ask you about the steepness perception experiments, and help me with the physics here.
Sure.
The amount of work that you have to do, or the amount of energy that you have to consume, it depends on the height of that you're raising the object, in this case your body, not the angle.
Right.
Therefore, perception of slope is largely, of course, you know, the physics of moving are a little different than pure physics, but this perception of slope is largely irrelevant to the amount of work that you have to do. But if we assume that a person has a pretty accurate perception of the angle of the eye, you know, the top of the hill compared to the horizon, in other words, the angle that the total hill subtends, the steeper the slope, given a particular angle, the lower the hill. And so the lower the slope, the higher the hill, because to subtend a particular angle, the hill has to be higher, i.e. farther away, if the slope is lower. So it seems to me that your predictions are actually the opposite of what you found. That is, if I see a hill and I see the top of it there,
Right.
if the slope is lower, the hill is actually higher. And I have to do more work to get up to the top. Whereas if the hill is very steep, the top of it is very close to me, and I don't have to do very much work to get to the top.
Right. I should say, so one thing about the hills we usually use is that they're, and as you can see here too, they're quite, I mean, we select hills that tend to be quite challenging. So first of all, somewhat long, and so usually one wouldn't, for example, be able to see the horizon, or one would, it's really...
But the pure physics of it is that it doesn't matter how steep the slope is. You have to do, the amount of work depends on the actual vertical elevation change. And that if the hill is very steep,
Right.
and you have an accurate perception of what angle the hill subtends, that means that the hill is not very tall. And if the hill if the slope is very low, that means the hill is actually very high, and you've got a lot of work to do to get to the top. So it seems to me that the physics of the energy involved in getting to the top predicts exactly the opposite from the results that you
But that
get.
would, so I'm not sure I understand. So but if you have a hill that's both steep and long, right? So you're talking in comparison to a hill that's just shallow and flat.
I'm saying that if I see accurately that this is where the top of the hill is,
Right.
if I think the hill is very shallow, that means the hill is very tall, because the top is much further away. But if I see that if I think the hill is very steep, it means the top is very close to me, and therefore the hill is not as high. So in other words, if I'm looking at Mount Everest from far away, it subtends the same angle as the top of the bookcase there, okay? So if I think that the slope is high, what that means is the object is very close and not so tall.
But
if I
it
think
is
the slope
still
is low, it
different.
means the object is far,
But
the top of it's far away, and therefore there's a lot of work required to get to the top.
But it's about the difficulty, right? It's about how I mean, a hill like that will be much more difficult
Not if
to
you
get
go
up.
slowly.
Well,
But Alan, it's an intriguing idea you have, but it assumes that there are no visual cues of distance.
No, it doesn't assume that there are no cues, but it assumes
It assumes that the only cue
that
is
you have
the
a
angle
very, I'm
subtended.
assuming you have a very accurate cue as to what angle it subtends, okay? That
Right,
you-
but
you're
the
just
hills
looking
that,
at.
the hills that she's using, at least the photographs that we've seen, they're objects that provide visual cues of distance.
All I'm saying is
So-
slope is irrelevant to the amount of work that you have to do to get up. And in
Okay.
fact, as a first level of approximation, there's no prediction. But if you assume that they have a reasonably accurate prediction of the angle subtended by the hill, the lower the slope, the higher the hill, the more work is required to get to the top.
see, but I'm not sure it's about getting to the top. It's about the effort to get up in any way, right? Not just reaching all the way to the top, but going from the point where you're standing, any sort of amount will be difficult if a hill is like that. And in
Well,
fact,
you use more energy depending on the height of the hill, not depending on the angle.
No, that's,
Well-
as you said, holding aside the physics of locomotion, but of course this is about the physics of locomotion, so you can't hold that aside.
No, but the number of calories you'll use is going to be, and also the lower the slope, the longer the distance you've got to go, the more, if you talk about friction and so forth, the more calories you're going to use up walking that long distance.
see, that I don't think that's true. That if one were to think in terms of calories, given the difficulty of getting up a hill like that, I would imagine, we haven't measured this, but I would imagine one uses much more calories to get up a steep hill, even if the hill is not very long, as opposed to a very shallow hill
Well,
where...
if that's true, then it's violating the physics of the.
See, but it's not about it's not about physics, it's about how your body can handle that walk.
Well, your body is
up the
controlled
hill.
by the physics.
Well, it depends upon how much of your maximum effort you're having to use with each step. You walk up one flight of stairs, taking 3 at a time, and see how you feel going up that one flight of stairs, and then walk up 3 flights of stairs, taking one at a time. Now, by physics, you're using more energy going up the 3 flights, but you're putting your muscles into the red zone, and when you do that, you're in pain.
Well, and
if we're
perhaps,
talking
you know,
about pain, that's different from
perhaps
energy.
another finding is relevant in this context. So Denny Profit and colleagues have shown that an identical hill will look steeper from the bottom than from the top. If it's a hill where one can reasonably get up, where the energy. So basically, the energy getting up is much higher than the energy getting down. So it's really all about your body's ability to deal with that hill, rather than the physics of it in some way. Yeah. Did you have a related question?
Not according to the physics.
No, it's okay.
But I'm very curious what you seem to be describing in terms of approach and pulling being paired with negative stimuli. It reminds me of Angela Duckworth's studies that she did on resilience and grit.
Okay.
And I wondered if you had ever sort of made any kind of cross comparison here. I think it would be really interesting to see. People have really been trying to define, especially in education, how do we teach grit? How do we teach resilience?
Remind me of that particular finding you're thinking of. I may not be as much aware of the details as you are.
Well, actually, nobody's really been able to successfully work out a scale in order to measure resilience and grit. It seems to be something kind of elusive. But when you're saying that this element of challenge is being introduced, and it is increasing a person's motivation and their desire to complete this task, I just find the way that you're languaging it to be very similar to what it is that we seek in terms of engaging with this idea of resilience, and why some humans just seem to have it and they're like more capable of surviving harsher conditions, and other people just don't seem to have that sort of inner resolve.
Right. It's very interesting. I think I hadn't thought about it in this particular context you're mentioning, but in that literature that relates to threat versus challenge, that's exactly about that idea, right? That a person may see the identical, or two people may see the identical difficult situation. For example, a standard paradigm that they use is a stressful job interview, right? Where it's stressful for anybody, but some people may feel like it's a challenge, it's something they can rise to, whereas others it's out of. It completely surpasses the ability they have to cope. So I think it's an interesting question, what it is that gives people that internal sense of being able to cope with a challenge or not, where on an objective level it's the same kind of stimulus. And in terms of how one could harness that in the context of education or other situations, it's an interesting question. I suppose in some of the work we've done, for example, where we induce power, right? The power manipulation, where it's simply about thinking of a time when you had control over resources, as opposed to somebody else had control over your resources and you were depending on them, right? That in itself makes a difference, right? Just kind of mentally rehearsing that notion that, well, there were times in the past where you felt you were in charge, even if right now that doesn't apply, right? So, or similarly with the social support manipulation, where you simply bring to mind somebody who's very supportive and who's always there for you and so on, even if that's just a mental image and nothing tangible at the moment, that has an effect as well on perception. So it suggests that I suppose a lot of it is psychological, right? And just this notion of, okay, am I able to cope? Am I able to deal with a challenge or not? Yes.
Yeah, I had a question about, in your abstract, you mentioned that these results pose a challenge for conventional views of perception. You mentioned Pylyshyn and the bottom-up idea. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that more. In particular, I think that the fact that there's accurate slope report through the haptic mode, but an inaccurate slope report through the verbal and the other dialogue mode is interesting because it suggests that the visual system is delivering accurate information about the slope to parts of the brain.
Right, that's right.
And so I'm wondering, to what degree can you say that this reflects perceptual processes as opposed to post-perceptual processes, like reporting and...
Right. See, that's a very good question, and that is often a criticism of this kind of work, where people say, well, but is it real perception, right? But then my response to that is, how do you measure real perception? Or what is that other pure or real perception that's different from what people do when you ask them a question, right? So first of all, the biggest problem, of course, with perception is that you do have to ask people certain questions, or they have to give a report. They have to give a subjective report of something in terms of...
Well, but you can have perceptual studies that do things like measure eye movements and things like that, right? So you can measure whether certain stimuli are noticeable and
right,
things like
but then, of course, people look at things without perceiving them, or people, you still need, at some point, sooner or later, you have to ask people questions, right, about, okay, what is it that you perceive? And once you have that, it's just awfully difficult to get around that. And also, I do think, what our work suggests is that in a way, perceptual judgments are very similar to other judgments, where we take into account the context, we take into account what it means in that given situation, and whether that, whatever input I'm getting, whether it's relevant or not. So for example, about the approach cues, is approach really something that applies to that behavior, or as we've showed, if it's completely ruled out, then it's meaningless.
Right.
So that's very similar to work on influences of affect, on various judgments, judgments across the board, where it's always about, okay, that input I'm getting, it must be meaningful, so therefore I apply it unless I'm told otherwise, or unless I have reason to believe that it's irrelevant, in which case I set it aside. So I think what this work points to really is that, I would argue there is no such thing as pure perception or pure judgment independent of all the other stuff, right? Because that is what we're doing. When we're judging things, we take into account things that are meaningful.
Can I just follow up briefly? That's a reasonable thing. That seems a completely reasonable position to say, and in some ways, I would agree with you that the question of whether something's perceptual or not is really what label we apply to it to some degree. But from a functional perspective, it is interesting that accurate judgments do occur. There's an accurate representation of the angle in the brain somewhere, right? And you gave, I think, an interesting interpretation of why you would want it to be in the dorsal stream to have the accurate slope representation. But then I'm wondering, for the ventral stream then, it's interesting that this is all, because the other thing that came to mind is that, with a lot of judgment tasks, one of the things that one worries about is whether, especially when it's a report task, that there's some sort of a, self-presentation, impression management or something like that. So, I'm thinking about the case of, because it's going through the mouth, right? And then and it's going through a mechanism that is communicating something to someone else.
That's right.
And I'm wondering, some of the results, like I have to wear a goofy costume and walk around the quad, and then you ask me how far it is.
That's right, absolutely.
I could imagine a case where you might modify what you're saying, even though some part of your brain knows how far it is. Another part of your brain wants to say, for whatever reason, it's really not that far.
Sure. No, I think that's a valid point, that there could be demand characteristics with some of these studies, right? And I think that's a reasonable concern that applies to some studies but not others. So for example, if you think of pressing against the step ladder, people probably wouldn't know which way they're supposed to respond, or they wouldn't, they would, or even with any of these approach avoidance manipulations, and in fact, the predictions are sometimes a bit counterintuitive too. So just trying to figure out as a participant how you're supposed to respond or to look good.
Well, I'm not saying it's conscious, but I'm thinking, because some of the things might be reminiscent of bragging. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but like, that hill doesn't look so steep to me. I feel strong or something like that, and so I say that hill doesn't look so steep.
Sure. See, but the bragging, that should occur across conditions, right? that shouldn't confound the effect of the manipulation.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, that's true.
yeah, so I think it's a problem for some studies, but it couldn't really explain all the studies, and especially the ones with individual differences, for example, where it's not. I mean, people have no way of knowing. Anyway, for a lot of the work, it would be obvious to people how to respond. Yes, Dan.
So I'm still struggling with the kind of conceptual account of the interaction of approach, avoid, and positive, negative. So you built the case for that on the basis of sort of, well, here are some prior findings. Those prior findings are potentially explicable in terms of something like cognitive dissonance, and here are our findings, and there's a clear pattern there. So I'm not challenging the empirical result. Instead, I'm trying to make sense of it. Now, when I think conceptually, my own inclinations, as you know, are to think in terms of ultimate function from an evolutionary perspective.
Right.
That's not, of course, the only way.
Right.
Now, in looking at it from that perspective, with the negative stimuli, your results are very sensible. That is, if my actions are bringing me closer to a negative stimuli, then the time that I have prior to contact with it, before I have to deal with it, is shortening.
Yes.
Therefore, a kind of error management conservative perspective is to assume it's going to get here sooner rather than later. I better be prepared for it.
Right, right.
That all makes perfectly good sense in sort of conceptual clarity, and you can even throw away the whole evolution component and just say that's something that people learn over the course of individual development. Fine, that'll work too. But now I come to the positive one, and I don't have a sort of conceptual frame that makes sense of why, when I'm trying to avoid a positive stimulus, it seems closer to me than when I'm trying to approach a positive stimulus. And I didn't, if you made a conceptual argument in presenting it, I didn't follow it. It seemed to me you were building that from prior results.
Well, our explanation, and it's true, I mean, the findings are a bit counterintuitive, right? That in a way, I mean, the effects are very strong. I mean, we ran a bunch of studies and we get it every single time.
As I said, I'm not challenging the empirical result.
That's right. So the question is, what is going on? And our best explanation at the moment is that there's simply this notion that there's a conflict that needs to be resolved. That something doesn't fit, and when that happens, it's in a way adaptive. When you have that thing that needs resolving, you have it right in front of you. So when things don't make sense, and you need to engage with it some more, you need to address it, you need to sink down some more resources and figure out what's going on, then if it's immediately in front of you, it challenges you to do something. So it's this notion of, something doesn't make sense, do something. And it's true. I mean, at the end, it's a bit surprising that this happens. And I think what's important too is to keep in mind that in our context, people don't necessarily have any sort of goal-related desires towards the positive or negative stimuli, right? So the situation could be very different. Let's say if you're hungry and you're looking at all the food items, or if you're thirsty, and so on. And this is what Emily Welchetis has shown to some extent. So, but I suppose at the moment our best guess is that it's simply it's an example of inconsistency that people try to deal with. So that your behavior doesn't fit the stimulus. And when that's the case, you put on the brakes and you figure out what's wrong here.
So, and I'm reading into what you're saying. You didn't actually say this now or during the presentation, but there's a way of thinking about it conceptually then that, I'm getting some proprioceptive information that's telling me that I'm avoiding something, right?
Right.
Presumably. I mean,
Sure.
I'd like to know how robust those approach-avoid manipulations are. I understand that your results are consistent, but how much do they map onto, say, some more ecological measure of whether people...
So first of all, we get the exact same thing with the actual push versus pull versus, and the maze task, right? So actually engaging the muscle as opposed to just cognitively putting yourself in the mindset of approach versus avoidance, that seems to lead to identical results.
I mean...
And I should say that whole push-pull manipulation is very robust. I mean, we've used it a bunch of times. There's a huge literature using that. In fact, it is surprising just how effective it is to just press against the table a little bit with your hand.
So am I understanding your argument correctly then that a part of the mind is saying, oh, well, we're clearly, we, the collective agent, we're clearly trying to avoid this thing. So that must be our goal at the moment. This thing is normally attractive and we're trying to avoid it. So there must be more information that we, the superordinate agent, doesn't understand.
I think it has to do with seeking out more information or trying to resolve this. Maybe that's a good way of putting it, actually, that an attempt to take in more information or take in, what shall I say, to make an effort to deal with things that don't fit, right? And perhaps to try to think of, okay, what does that mean? Or is there something else behind that, right? So perhaps as a general sense of something doesn't make sense. What is this telling me? I need to be vigilant, I need to be alert, I need to, pay attention. Yes?
Hi, really interesting stuff. I have 3 hopefully very short questions, but all kind of related to the haptic measurements or
Right.
the sort of embodied estimation. One, I was struck with, at least I think in the photo where you had the estimation board, that it was parallel to the hill.
Right.
So I was curious whether you've done the manipulation where it's 90 degrees and if you get different.
See, that's a very good question, which I neglected to mention. It's very important that participants don't look at their hand. And it's really, the idea is, it's almost as if you're trying to capture how you would put your hand on the hill, right? So it's meant to be a very direct estimate that doesn't require any translation of, like, for example, if you were to do it in a different direction already, that would be a very, very different process, I would imagine. So it's really all about, okay, imagine you put your hand right on the hill, because it's about capturing that sense of how you would act. And that's really important.
So
Rather
so
than
does
looking at the
anyone
hand
know-
and thinking, oh, well, that looks about right or not, and so on.
But does anyone know what does happen or would happen if you're doing the same embodied estimation, but it's incongruent with the...
Well, I suppose, I'm not sure I would try to do that simply because then it captures probably something else, a different process. That's no longer about how would I, in a way, put my foot on that hill.
Okay.
That's what we're trying to capture.
There's
Okay,
a
so there
spatial
was-
rotation component
Yeah.
there, right?
No, I know, I was just
That's
curious.
harder.
I mean, because,
Yeah.
then you had the one where the slope, where you're pulling up the slope, and I mean, that is not in the same direction as the hill, so it's rotated. And I mean, I know that it's different haptic, but I was just curious about that. So my second question is, have you, I think the question of sort of estimation from the hand versus the foot is an interesting one. And so I was wondering whether you had done, or whether anyone had done these kinds of tasks with, say, putting someone on a treadmill and saying, like, like lock it when your 2 feet are, apart as they would be stepping up the hill, or something like that, where you are really asking them not to do the transposition to a different part of the body.
Right.
You could do the haptic measure just with a foot instead of the hand. You don't need a fancy treadmill.
I think
Just do
that's
what you're
been
doing
done.
with that.
That's been done, actually.
It's just harder to flex your foot.
Yeah, that's it. Well, that's it. So one criticism of the haptic measure has been that, well, could it, with a foot that would be even more of a problem, could it be just the kind of mechanics of how far back you can move your hand without, there's a limit, or there's a comfort issue. And that's been recently addressed by Frank Eves and Guy Taylor Coville at Birmingham. They've developed a new, in a way, contraption that can replace the haptic measure, where it's more like a sling, where you can, make the haptic estimate without having that constraint of movement of the wrist, or as you would have with the foot as well, and that leads to identical estimates.
Cool. Okay, can I ask one more thing?
Sure.
So I was curious with this, so with the haptic board, if you locked it so that you either had to pull up the front or push down the back to make the slope, could you get the same push versus pull approach avoidance? I'm just, was just curious whether anyone had done that.
Sorry. So
That's a good idea.
you're talking about the haptic.
Yeah, so if you
And
have
then-
the board here and you either lock it at the base so that you
Right.
estimate by pulling it towards you, or
Oh,
you
I
lock it
see.
far away so you
Oh,
estimate
right.
by pushing this
Huh.
down, whether you predict you would get the same
Interesting.
kind of approach avoidance.
We certainly haven't done it. So wait, what would you predict then? So you would,
I mean, I would just predict that that would be another way, but a sort of integrated way of having the approach avoidance manipulation, right? So if you lock the back of it,
Right.
and you have to pull it towards you to
Right.
raise it, then you would expect.
but then in a way you're combining the measurement with the manipulation,
Yeah, you
right?
are.
So, but then what would that do? I mean, so I'm trying to think what it would mean if that made a difference. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure, but it's an interesting idea actually. It's interesting to consider that.
And I just thought that in the board, it seems like it's naturally, I mean, I haven't played it once, so I don't know, but just looking at it, it seemed like you're probably doing more pushing than anything, because you're not pulling up on, I mean, you're tilting your hand, but it's
Yeah.
still.
Well, it's actually, it's a pretty easy movement actually. You don't need to push or pull much. It's very easy to adjust actually. So I wouldn't worry, I'm not too
It's
worried
hinged in the middle?
Sorry? Yeah, roughly. And again, what really gives me confidence about that measure is that new measurement, the kind of sling version that really has, leads to exact same findings. So it doesn't seem to be an issue about how that particular tool is set up. Yes.
I was wondering about, so the verbal reports of these things all require numerical literacy?
Right.
So I was wondering how you would do this in a place where people don't routinely estimate. Because I mean,
Well,
that's one
so
of the
actually,
concerns,
that's right.
estimating angles with numbers and
That's
weights
right,
with numbers
yes.
and things like that.
Which is why that the visual measure is really important, and the two correlate very highly. So really the visual, where you have that pie-shaped piece, it's non-verbal, but it's a similar process because you can be careful and a little bit back and forth and so on, as opposed to the haptic, which is much more about this action link. So if one were to take this somewhere else, one could just do with a visual and forget about the verbal if
What about the
necessary.
weight one?
The weight. Yeah, that is more tricky. I mean, so what people have done in general though is to have various matching estimates, right? So sometimes you can have, or in fact, so with a distance estimate, for example, right? You have the measuring tape as opposed to giving a number. So it's matching the length of the tape to the distance between yourself.
But I mean, that kind of raises what Erica, I mean,
And-
one of the things about the tape thing is that you're asking them to match horizontal distance to this distance.
But that's part of the point, right? Otherwise, you could just match it up, right? If I say, well, how far away is that thing, and you put the tape here, well, then you're basically measuring it.
It's true, I just want that, I mean, it goes back to, I mean, you just wonder if, I mean, if the whole point of this is that you're showing how inaccurate people are, you'd think that what you really want to do is give them the best chance to be accurate.
But
It's
there
not
are,
about accurate or I mean,
Because you're asking, I mean, why they would not estimate right when you're mapping this to this, and it's an interesting question, but.
but again, if you just had the measurement tape here, you're literally measuring, right? You're no longer estimating. You're no longer talking about your perception. It becomes just about the tool.
so Clark, a method that speaks to your question some, and I mean, obviously for pragmatic reasons, Simone hasn't used it in these, but this blind walking paradigm.
That's
where,
right.
People close their eyes and walk, until they think that they've reached a target that they previously saw, right? And the
That's
nature of
right.
the target affects when they stop.
Yeah.
There's no spatial rotation,
Yeah.
there's no comparison across modalities, right? They know their own gait, etc., right? And yet there are effects of the nature of the target that they're walking to, right? And there are priming effects with regard to, having people in different cognitive states or affective states before they do the task. So there are ways around this issue of, how much of it is just impression management, how much of it is real perceptual judgment. I don't think it's completely intractable. So it suggests that there's something beyond just those considerations.
I mean, the thing is, I wasn't trying to say that impression management would be the only kind of thing that can affect these, just that if you can show that accurate information is represented somewhere,
Right.
Then that suggests that, you know, there's a point of information entry into the brain where it's accurate, and then what you're measuring is some additional.
That's right.
You're measuring some additional thing, which is interesting to know what that is. I mean, impression management obviously can't explain all these results, but you mentioned planning and things like that. You might expect systems to say, well, I've got this estimate of what the slope is, and now I'm going to prepare my walking effort based on the accurate estimate plus some other information I have about how heavy the backpack is.
I think that's right. I think what you're alluding to and touching upon is really this, and Dan to some extent too, this distinction between how you act as opposed to how you plan. And our findings, or these estimates, are really, the argument at least is it's mostly about the planning, right? That's where you take into account resources. When it comes to how you do things, there needs to be, you need to know you need to always walk in the right way, or or walk up the hill in a particular way that takes into account the mechanics of your foot and so on.
So I mean,
really,
I think that's totally sensible. So I mean, the reason I'm asking, I work, in a place where people don't have accurate, they couldn't report accurate number concepts. I mean, the measuring tape thing is one, I guess what I'm concerned about is ecological fluidity.
Sure.
Right? So I mean, you want a task where in the real world you're asking somebody to do something that matches what they would have to do.
Right.
And something like, walk with your eyes closed until you think you're at the thing seems like a pretty good one.
Right.
Saying in numbers how heavy something is doesn't strike me as as that matching to what you have to do or to match.
We thought about matching, but then we realized that if whatever task we have is influenced by let's say some manipulation, then the matching task itself would be influenced by that.
Yeah.
If you see what I mean, right? So then in a way you're changing the ruler, and that ruler is no longer as objective as it should be according to that logic. So it is tricky at the end. It's very tricky.
I mean, with weight, you would think that some kind of task, like which of these things would you rather carry a mile or something like that would be the kind of thing that you ask people.
But then it's a different question, right? Do you want to, as opposed to how does it look, right? Or how does it feel?
Right. True.
Could you ask how many of these could you carry? I mean, if you had a...
Right. See, but then it again becomes about the action, not about the perception, right? It's about would you want to do this as opposed to, what do you see? Yeah. And I think what you touched upon, this whole issue of what is real perception, right? Or what it, as opposed to all these other things that could play a role, I think it's really difficult to disentangle. And at the end, I mean, as soon as you ask people questions, this is the issue you run into.
Other questions? One more.
It's really short and cheeky. Are women wearing heels worse estimators of slope?
We haven't looked at that, but I would imagine so. I mean, that based on all the other findings, right? It's about how able you are in that given moment to engage with that environment. So if you'll just get stuck in the grass or you fall over, then that's not going to be helpful.
But they feel more powerful.
Okay, so I guess I was curious about the sort of mechanics at the moment of estimation versus the planning process, because you could have someone like standing on a slope making an estimate about another slope. So I did some work in spatial perception. I know there was a whole line of work where they were kind of putting people on different slopes and having them estimate slopes. Right. And it seemed to make some difference there, but I do think that the question of like how able are you to climb the hill in heels, of course, is like its own thing. But if you said like you can put on your hiking boots before you climb the hill, I mean, I guess I was just curious, kind of like perception
it's
versus
really,
the planning to act.
I think it's really about the current state that you're in that moment, as opposed to what you could imagine doing or whatever. Your body tells you right then and there, this is going to be easy or difficult, and the perception then feeds back onto that and says, okay, that's a good idea or not. So as soon and then these things can change on a moment's notice. If you change your shoes or you have another drink or all that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you.